touched upon this in the previous module, but just as witches are a core part of the Halloween pageantry, so too are their frequent companions and tools: black cats, cauldrons, and cleaning contraptions, aka brooms. I just like the alliteration. Each of these we'll explore individually. A fascinating thing about human civilization is that it seems to have certain patterns, characteristics that show up again and again regardless of the geographical location or time period one's dealing with. A lesser example of that is the fact that, throughout history, cats have had special status in many cultures. Perhaps most famously, while the ancient Egyptians did not worship cats, as you'll often see claimed, they did view them as special animals that should be both deeply revered and also feared, at least a little bit. Recent studies indicate that the Egyptians may have been one of the first human civilizations to domesticate cats, likely doing so to ward off snakes and other dangerous pests that needed to be kept out of homes. Yet while cats were depicted as protective and nurturing, they could also be fierce and aggressive, which likely contributed to their association with rulers and deities. For example, the goddess Sekhmet, known as the Powerful One, was a protector of the sun and a daughter of Ra. She carried a papyrus scepter and could award life and fertility, particularly by making the Nile River flow regularly every year. Relevant to our discussion, Sekhmet was a feline goddess, most often depicted as having a lioness head backed by a sun disk that displayed her power and authority. A similarly revered feline goddess was Bastet, who was a royal deity with protective powers, often depicted as a seated cat with a scarab on her head. Together, these goddesses were often invoked to establish protectiveness and power, two things particularly important to the pharaohs in their positions as rulers of Egypt. This reverence translated to Egyptians depicting cats quite often in both religious and everyday life, adorning their homes, temples, and tombs with images of cats. Parents would nickname their female children Meat, which means cat, and according to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, Egyptians would even shave off their eyebrows when the family cat passed away. This was followed by elaborate burial ceremonies, an account that is likely somewhat accurate given that archaeologists have uncovered the world's oldest pet cemetery in Egypt, a nearly 2,000-year-old burial ground that contains mostly cats wearing iron and beaded collars. What's more, cats were frequently mummified and placed in human burial tombs, positioned in places of honor alongside the dead. This practice became so popular, in fact, that a cottage breeding industry seems to have arisen that involved people breeding cats purely for sacrifice and mummification. In such cases, the oft quite young cat was sacrificed, tightly wrapped in linen, and then its features painted in black ink. It's believed that these mummies were offered to temples as signs of gratitude to the gods or meant to be both companions and protectors in the afterlife. Those in ancient India and Persia also revered cats, and just like in a Tom and Jerry cartoon, many cultures also depicted conflicts between cats and mice. Whole books have even been written about that. The ancient Greeks and Romans had a slightly more distant relationship with cats, perhaps because they were one of the many animals sometimes associated with the Greek goddess Hecate, a goddess of magic, witchcraft, necromancy, creatures of the night, crossroads, and often even death. Some historians also argue that in the latter Greek area, Bastet was melded somewhat with the Greek goddess Artemis, given that in the Roman author Ovid's Metamorphoses, the goddess Phoebe, an alternate name for Diana, Rome's version of Artemis, escaped to Egypt with other gods and disguised herself as a cat while hiding near the Nile. Several hundred years later, during the Viking Age, cats continued their association with the divine, given that Freya, the goddess of fertility, love, and beauty, among other things, traveled on a chariot pulled by cats. She could predict the future, wield magic, and oversaw a mystical land called Folkvangr, which housed half of all Norse warriors in preparation for the final battle, Ragnarok. This translated to everyday life for the Vikings, who were not only reported to take cats with them on naval expeditions, but were so partial to the animal that studies have shown Scandinavian cats increased in size during the Viking Age, contrary to the normal pattern of domestication where animals get smaller over time. Although we don't know too much about everyday Celtic life and the specifics of Celtic religious belief, as we discussed in a previous module, it seems that they also associated cats with divination and otherworldly encounters. In one of the most famous old Irish tales written in the 1st century CE, The Voyage of Maelduin, the eponymous protagonist, i.e. it was Maelduin, traveled to many islands, one of which was inhabited by a cat. When one of Duin's companions attempted to steal a gold and silver necklace from the island, the cat transformed and burned the man to ashes. Maelduin, apparently used to crazy events by that time, soothed the cat, swept up the ashes, poured them into the ocean, and then went about his business. On the much darker side, there is evidence that Scottish Druids used animal sacrifice for divination, the practice of Tugharm, which involved cats, often black cats, either skinned or boiled alive. This practice continued on into the 19th century with a story recounting the ceremony published in the 1824 London Literary Magazine. Not great. So, to aggregate all of that, many cultures throughout time have both admired cats and associated them with magic, witchcraft, the afterlife, and supernatural powers in general, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And given that Europeans, both on the continent and across the British Isles, were influenced by Greco-Roman culture, Celtic culture, and Viking culture, it's no surprise that these various impressions of cats were carried through into Christian Europe. Much like Samhain tropes and the continuation of a belief in witches, the idea that cats could have supernatural power was surely carried through, although evidence for that is a tad scarce. Much like early Christians, such as St. Augustine of Hippo, wrote about how witchcraft was harmless superstition, cats having mystical powers was, for a while at least, probably set aside too. This is likely why cats were popular characters in medieval manuscripts, added to the margins of handwritten books as a bit of flair, or even to the main illustrations themselves at times. While to modernize many of the images might seem sinister, that was not the intent of the scribes themselves in most cases. Instead, the frisky felines were depicted as catching mice, playing instruments, doing various tasks, and even just taking a break to give themselves a tongue bath. So much like today, for most of the early and high Middle Ages, circa 700 to circa 1200, cats were the same useful pets, companions, and sometimes jerks they are today, supplemented by a dash of lingering cultural superstition about their potential mystical powers. All fairly innocuous, right? Yes! Indeed, contrary to very, very popular belief, there was no widespread killing of cats in the medieval period. Some incorrect accounts contradicting this assertion point to 1233, when Pope Gregory IX released an invective titled the Vox in Rama. In the letter, the Pope warned King Henry VII of Germany and Archbishop Siegfried III of Mainz to beware what he felt was a rise in devil-worshipping in the Holy Roman Empire. In the text itself, Gregory recounted stories his inquisitors had elicited from members, i.e. tortured out of innocent people, describing how those who joined the sect witnessed the statue of a black cat come to life, whereupon members kissed the cat's backside, thus proclaiming their allegiance to the devil. This so-called osculum infame, kiss of shame, did become a hallmark of witch confessions and general devil worshipping in the early modern era. But to be clear, while Gregory encouraged cracking down on devil worshipping, he neither tied that practice to witchcraft nor asked the readers to start massacring cats. Moreover, even if he did, Gregory sent his letter to 5 people, not across the entire Christian world, in hopes of sparking a feline genocide. Thus, the belief that people killed cats by the thousands in the 1200s and 1300s in Europe is complete fiction. This in turn means that the oft-repeated story that the 1348 to 1351 Black Death spread as easily as it did because there were no cats around to kill the rats carrying the fleas that killed 50% of Europe is also complete fiction. No medieval accounts from the mid-14th century talk about people suddenly turning on cats. There is no mention of a widespread absence of cats for some other reason going into the 1340s, and there was no recorded excess of rats running around that then carried the plague-laden fleas across the continent. Indeed, research indicates that giant Asian gerbils were responsible for the plague transforming from ground soil to humans in the late 1330s and early 1340s, not rats. Cats can also carry plague just as easily as rats, while more research shows that cats are reluctant rat killers at best. Plus, given how outrageously infectious the Black Death was, it spread across Europe at an estimated 4 kilometers a day. In the words of one historian, quote, "It's highly unlikely that the ecclesiastical cat assassins, however hell-bent, could have killed anywhere near enough cats to alter the Black Death's trajectory," end quote. Just like we now know that simple breathing can spread COVID-19, personal contact, bodily fluid exchange, food sharing, and even breathing likely caused Yersinia pestis to kill at least 25 million people across Europe, around 30%, if not up to 50% of the population between 1348 and 1351. Another way we know this is that into the late Middle Ages, even Christian monks seemed no more hesitant towards cats than they had been in the 9th century, when an Irish monk wrote an entire poem dedicated to his cat named Pangur Ban. Quote, "I and Pangur Ban, each of us two at his special art, his mind at hunting mice, my own mind is in my special craft. I love to rest, better than any fame, at my booklet with diligent science. Not envious of me is Pangur Ban, he himself loves his childish art. When we are, tale without tedium, in our house, we two alone, we have unlimited feet sport, something to which to apply our acuteness. It is customary at times by feat of valor that a mouse sticks in his net. And for me there falls into my net a difficult dictum with hard meaning. His eye, this glancing full one, he points against the wall fence. I myself, against the keenness of science, point my clear eye, though it is very feeble. He is joyous with speedy going where a mouse sticks in his sharp claw. I, too, am joyous where I understand a difficult dear question. Though we are thus always, neither hinders the other. Each of us, too, likes his art, amuses himself alone. He himself is the master of the work which he does every day, while I am at my own work, which is to bring difficulty to clearness." End quote. Fast forward to the 15th century, and a Croatian manuscript literally attests to how accepted cats still were by that point. Not only did the scribe in that case own a cat, but like any modern cat sitting on your keyboard while you're trying to type, this cat didn't appreciate its master working on the manuscript rather than paying attention to him or her. It therefore spilled the scribe's ink, then walked on the book itself, the proof of this mischief surviving to this day. Around the same time in the Netherlands, another monk wrote a note in a manuscript he was working on, indicating that the blank spots on a page were not missing, but rather the result of a recalcitrant cat peeing on the book during the night. As he wrote, quote, "Here is nothing missing, but a cat urinated on this during a certain night. Cursed be the pesty cat that urinated over this book during the night in Deventer, and because of it many other cats too. And beware well not to leave open books at night where cats can come." But if all of that is true, then how did cats get so closely associated with witchcraft and the devil? Well, the answer closely mirrors our discussion of witches during the early modern witchcraft craze. Witches continued to exist throughout the Middle Ages, although mostly as pagan cultural symbols carried over from the pre-Christian period, neither inherently good nor inherently bad. Yet when the Reformation began and people began to acutely fear the devil's influence, anything alleged to be a witch was associated both with heresy and the devil, then punished accordingly. Thus, cats, long associated with witches and the supernatural in pre-Christian cultures, were still considered possibly magical but mostly innocuous in the medieval period until the Reformation, when they too became associated with the devil. According to early modern demonic witch lore, not only were witches closely associated with cauldrons and the ability to fly, but once a witch signed a covenant with the devil gave the witch a familiar, an animal that would aid the witch in carrying out evil deeds. Thus, witches didn't always have cats, but instead, hearkening forward to Harry Potter, they could also be rats, owls, dogs, or other common animals. Witches could also shapeshift and become animals themselves, although often witches were said to become wolves or even werewolves, which we'll talk about in a future module. We can see how this imagery became so pervasive that in numerous confessions of alleged witches, cats were mentioned. A confession from a woman in Chelmsford in 1566 claimed that during her earliest interactions with the devil, he appeared to her in the shape of a white spotted cat. As she grew older, she kept the cat, who with her enacted various evil deeds on the people living nearby. In a book of confessions from alleged witches in 1617, several mentioned the devil appearing to them in the shape of a cat, while later confessions from Huntington invoked feline imagery as well. Decades later, in 1692, Salem accused witch Bridget Bishop, quote-unquote, confessed to suckling cats after striking her deal with the devil, while Sarah Carrier testified that a cat threatened to tear her to pieces if she did not place her hand on a devil's Bible. Such testimony is likely why early modern Christian imagery, in particular depictions of the Last Supper, at times showed Judas accompanied by a cat. Yet as you might have noticed, most of those confessions didn't mention black cats. Indeed, statements that the demonic cats were black occurred rather infrequently, with other colors brought into the mix quite a lot. The enslaved woman Tituba, who was one of the first alleged witches arrested during the Salem witch trials, confessed to seeing one black cat, but also one red one. An accuser during the trials claimed to have seen a suspicious cat roaming around, but it was a gray one, while more often than not, the Salem testimony about demonic cats in one of history's most famous witch trials noted no particular color at all. However, black cats in particular obviously became strongly associated with witches, which likely occurred for two reasons. First, as we talked about in a previous module, people in the pre-industrial world had a very different relationship with the night and darkness than we do today. Without the ability to easily see light spaces, once the sun had gone down, people often filled that darkness with uncertainty, spiritual power, potential danger, and at times intense fear. Thus, the darkness was not just an absence of light, but a mysterious zone that could be as easily filled with angels and demons as it was nothing at all. And so, both in the medieval and early modern eras, depicting something as literally black was often the best way to convey its evil nature. This is why in the Salem witch trial confessions, the one thing that was consistently described as black was the quote-unquote black man, aka the devil. The second reason that witches were associated with black cats in particular was what we today would call pre-modern popular culture. The wars of religion were an intense time of fear and violence for Europe. It's estimated that 1/3 of Germany alone was killed between 1618 and 1648, when Europe was embroiled in the Protestant versus Catholic showdown that was the 30 Years' War. The rampant fear of heresy and the devil, which in turn threatened people's very chance at salvation, created a type of public hysteria we can hardly understand, thus the growth in early modern witchcraft accusations. Yet at the same time, the devil, demons, the Antichrist, physical depictions of death, witches, and their accoutrement became very popular images in art, poetry, plays, folktales, and literature. Why? Well, much like people today make movies and TV shows about deadly natural disasters, serial killers, ghosts, demons, or other mythical monsters, creative expression was, and is, a way for people to engage in ideas and events that fascinate them as much as they terrify them. Thus, horror is frightening, but it can also trigger an adrenaline response that people tend to find appealing. As such, the common association between witches and black cats was created far more by early modern media than it was by actual accusations of or confessions of witchcraft in early modern Europe. For example, one of the earliest novels written in the English language rather than Latin, German, or French was a 1553 book called Beware the Cat. In that tale, a priest dabbling in alchemy drinks a potion that, it turns out, gives him the ability to understand cats. He proceeds to hear nearby felines talking about their everyday lives, but also discussing an Irish cat with magical powers named Grimalkin. Said Grimalkin, whose name derives from grey, i.e. the near black color, allegedly ate a child and also might have been a witch in disguise. More importantly, Beware the Cat was so popular that, like Band-Aids, Kleenex, chapstick, and Frisbees, many magical cats in subsequent British Isles lore and literature were referred to as Grimalkin or Graymilkin. This is why Shakespeare's 1606 play Macbeth not only features three witches cavorting around a cauldron, and those witches have the ability to see the future, but they're aided in their work by a cat named none other than Graymilkin. While hard to date, medieval and early modern folklore echoed these artistic depictions. For example, many Welsh tales were told about a monstrous giant black cat named Cath Palug, who took up residence on the Isle of Anglesey and killed as many as 180 knights. In some tales, he was slain by Sir Kay, the foster brother of legendary King Arthur, and a knight of the Round Table. In other stories, King Arthur himself fought Cath Palug, with both the cat and Arthur emerging as victorious, depending upon the specific story. There was also the Scottish Celtic cat sith, literally cat fairy, that was maybe actually a witch or maybe actually a fairy. Either way, it was black and the size of a dog, said to hunt the Scottish Highlands to steal the souls of the dead before they could ascend to heaven. There was also the even more sinister Scottish Big Ears, a demonic black cat with yellow eyes and, shocker, large ears that could be summoned during the above-discussed ceremony of Tag Hairm. Carrying the theme even further are the Cat Stones of Scotland, a series of natural stone features throughout the country that, according to myth, were locations that cats and/or witches gathered for various ceremonies. Technically, the term cat in this context is the modern version of the word cath, meaning battle, but that did not stop the early modern Scots from believing that witches and their cats gathered around them, particularly on Halloween. With the Irish likewise believing that cats were omens of dark things to come, it's no surprise that there's an Irish greeting that says, quote, "God bless all here except the cat," end quote. Along with the other images and themes we've discussed, these traditions permeated British culture and then were carried to the United States in the 19th century. Thus we have stories like Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, early 20th century Halloween adverts that prominently feature these frisky felines, news stories about Halloween parties with cat decorations, and the overall popular association between witches, black cats, and All Hallows Eve. So this Halloween, put up some cat decorations, acknowledge their historical ties to the holiday, and don't worry if one crosses your path. To do otherwise would be a genuine catastrophe. You're welcome.